All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Helene Poirson, advisor at the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF. And before we get started today into our main content, first, I just wanted to start by introducing the two distinguished speakers that we're honored to have with us today, Professor Moritz Schularick and Professor Pierre Yared, and say a few words about the work that they are doing in the world. So Moritz Schularick is the president of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and professor of economics at Sciences Po in Paris. He works in the fields of macrofinance, banking, financial stability, as well as international economics, political economy, and economic history. Professor Schularick's research provides new and innovative perspectives on central questions facing society: the origins of financial stability, the link between rising debt and inequality, the effects of monetary policy on asset prices, and the past and future of globalization. His paper with Oscar Jorda and Alan Taylor on credit cycles and financial stability, entitled Credit Booms Gone Bust, has provided the backdrop for so-called macroprudential policies aimed at curbing credit booms, and ranks among the most highly cited papers in macroeconomics in the past decade. Professor Schularick is a recipient of the 2022 Leibniz Prize, Germany's most important research prize awarded by the German Science Foundation. In 2018, he received the Gossen Prize of the German Economic Association, and he's an elected member of the Academy of Sciences of Berlin, his hometown. He regularly contributes to policy questions in the media. Our second distinguished speaker today is Pierre Yared. He is the MUTB Professor of International Business, the Senior Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs, and the Vice Dean for Executive Education at the Columbia Business School in New York. His work is at the intersection of macroeconomic policy and political economy. Professor Yared's academic research is on the political economy of central banking and government finances, and it's been published in leading academic journals. His track record of publications is truly impressive, including articles in the American Economic Review, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, Econometrica, the Journal of Political Economy, and the Journal of Economic Theory, to name just a few. He's research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Professor Yared also teaches global economic environment, a core MBA course in macroeconomics, for which he received the Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence. I was particularly intrigued to find out that Professor Yared co-authored the first fully digital interactive textbook for intermediate macroeconomics. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Economic Club of New York. So I'm so thankful that you both are here today to share your insights with us, Moritz and Pierre. I mean, I really love what you're up to in the world. I think it's so important that you're helping people to understand how political factors like the rise in populism are interacting with the economy at a time when we're under the shadow of the US election, and a record number of elections has already taken place this year. I was reading on Reuters that elections took place in over a dozen countries this year that are home to almost half of the world's population. And then on top of it, the votes are coming amidst economic and geopolitical strife with the Ukraine war, the conflicts in the Middle East, and the rising trade tensions between the US and China. In some countries, there are even concerns about democracy itself, as political discourse has polarized and election results have been or are being contested as we're speaking in the case of Georgia. So several themes have been prominent in the election campaigns this year. I'll name just three that are particularly relevant to our discussion today. The first theme in many campaigns is the cost of living concerns, including in the United States, where some of us live, and many Americans feel that their living standards are falling despite strong headline economic data. The second theme is the rise in populist rhetoric and support for far-right movements in Western countries, with a mix of nationalist policies and often unfunded economic spending plans. This theme, in turn, is related to the first one on the cost of living crisis, which has led to rising support for populism. Another third theme is the rise in public debt, with both the IMF and the BIS warning that fiscal plans could be derailed this year in a big election year like this, complicating efforts of central banks to bring inflation down to target and resulting in levels of debt that are making the global economy more vulnerable to financial shocks. So this brings us to one of the things that you talk about, Moritz. You talk about the economic costs of populism, how such policies influence three areas of the economy. And I wonder if you could talk more to our audience about that today. So we'll start with your presentation, Moritz, and then we'll go to Pierre's presentation, who will focus on the pressures that are faced by central banks to inflate, including from factors such as fiscal pressures, but also structural trends, including the green transition. So before I give you the floor, Moritz, I'd like to remind everyone that today's seminar, as usual, is being recorded and will be posted next week on our IEO website, as well as the IEO's YouTube channel, and will be available to those of you who would like to revisit the discussion. So thank you for joining us, and without further ado, Moritz, over to you. I think you have some slides.
Yes, thank you, Helene, and thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Also see many names, some of which I haven't talked to in a while. I'd love to catch up with in the audience. So thanks for joining in these numbers. Now I need to find my slides. They're here and share them with you. Can you maybe give me some quick feedback whether everything is readable and fine?
Yes, your slides appeared and disappeared, but I could see them.
Are they back on?
Not yet.
Okay, hang on. Why would that not be the case? So let me try again. So now you can see them?
Yes.
Okay, let me stay here. Apparently when I went into full screen, it didn't work. Maybe if someone has an idea, then otherwise I will just share this window. So this is a paper on the economic costs of populism. It is a joint work with Manuel Funke and Christoph Trebesch, who are also at the Kiel Institute and co-authors of mine. What we do in this paper is we do something that is very, very hard and a little bit of a complicated task, namely we're trying to define populism and populist leaders using definitions from political science, and then use those definitions to estimate the economic effects of populist leaders. And I don't have to talk much about the background and to this endeavor. It is well known that I think across the world, politicians that emphasize in their rhetoric and in their style of doing politics a so-called struggle between the people and the elites, whereas populists claim they speak for the people, the true people, versus the often, everything in quotation marks with the corrupt elites. And this is a political strategy that is not new. Actually, I'm going to show you some pictures in a second, going back to the 19th century or the 1800s. But it is one that has been particularly effective in recent decades, namely politicians claiming to be speaking for the people, being the sole representative of the people against a corrupt club of elites at the top. What this strategy does is it polarizes strongly the political discourse. It essentially puts people in us and them, in whether you're on the side of the people or on the side of the elites. And importantly, the style of doing politics, populism as a historical phenomenon, comes in two flavors. It comes with left-wing populism, and left-wing populism. Some of you might, have an idea about some episodes in Latin America, in across the 20th century, one should say. It's typically economic. What does that mean? It is a campaign where populist politicians stand up, presumably in the name of the people, against financial elites, against the economic elites, and argue for more redistribution. More recently, there has been a very successful flavor of populism that is more right-wing type, and it's a type of populism that, if you will, that loads on ethnic and religious differences, that pitches, the idea of a people that is sort of that in one way or the other is argued to be the true people that belongs on to the certain land, and campaigns against minorities and foreigners. It has often xenophobic elements, and that right-wing populism that has more of a national exclusive flavor has been, as I said, particularly successful in recent decades. Here's what I told you, like often seen as the first populists go back to the 19th century, famous speeches on about the cross of gold in US history, the arguments against the gold standard. So back then, a mobilization against financial elites in the interest of, at the time, very much of the farming so-called farming population and the farmers in the US. So populism as a political style, as a rhetoric, has been with us for a long time, and it has come back very strongly in recent years. So what we do in this paper is that we take a sort of really a mainstream definition of what populism is, and apply it to look at the economic outcomes of of populist government. So populism empower many countries right now, and while there's been a lot of work on the determinants of populism, and I know we all want to understand why these phenomena happen, why politics are shifting, why certain countries are so much more polarized today than others. There's been little work, except for the work that Rudy Dornbusch and Sebastian Edwards have done in the 1980s and early 1990s on Latin America, on the consequences of populists in power, populist policies. And that's what we do in this paper. I'm going to just give you a quick, I mean, most of you know this anyways, but basically two big explanations that are out there for the rise of populism, and they also have to do with, they go very much into the debate about inequality as well. So one is an economic one, where people emphasize essentially the dislocations resulting from technological change, or from globalization, or from financial crisis. So, you've all read the work about the China shock in the US, for example. So the idea that opening up to international trade has distributional effects, can lead to increased unemployment, can lead to uprooting of economic plans and employment in whole regions. A different flavor has to do with robots and automation, possibly in the future with AI. And then there's also obviously a role for financial crises in being a very clear moment in which the existing economic and political order is very much in crisis and is sort of delegitimized, and to some extent. The other explanation that people have there, and as I've said, this is not a paper about the determinants of populism, it's a paper about the consequences of populism, but I still wanted to tell you these things. And they will matter because obviously there is a big, as we call it these days in economics, a big identification problem, because populism is not a random phenomenon. It comes from somewhere, and these two somewheres are either economic or cultural. The cultural backlash hypothesis essentially maintains that it's about the social changes, the cultural changes that have taken place, or that are taking place regularly, and that under some circumstances, especially when there's too much migration, or things are happening too fast, and old routines and habits are upset too quickly, then under these circumstances, there is a backlash that is more against the loss of certain cultural values. So while we probably, in terms of like identifying causal effects, the cultural aspect is maybe somewhat less worrisome. Clearly, we need to keep in mind that there is an economic explanation out there in various papers, and we need to think about that when we determine the economic effects of the phenomenon. So let's turn to the consequences of populism. Let's look at populists in power, and I'm going to start with what especially my fantastic author Manuel Funke did work on, really do this groundbreaking historical work on populists in power. So we put together a database essentially of more than 1,500 leaders in 60 countries over the past 120 years. So, you know, classifying each of them as populist or non-populist. How do we do this? Well, first is we go to biographies, we go to the secondary literature about certain eras, certain policies, and then ask the question that is very much at the heart of the definition of populism, namely, is there a strategy that somehow pitches the elites against the true people? And in the second step, we say, well, was this more of a right-wing flavor, but was this more of a let's call it a nationalist, slightly probably like closed off, loading on ethnic and minority topics, or was it one of the more redistributionist left-wing type that we, for example, know from Latin America? So I mentioned we have this database, 60 countries, 120 years. That's a lot of data to work with. As a story aside, from those of you working in an international institution, you might have an idea what this meant in terms of checks and we started working at the paper when I was actually at the New York Fed, and President Trump at the time was the president of the US, and he's very much included in this classification, and so you can imagine how complicated this was. But this is an important point to stress, because this is not our classification here, but we always, in each individual case of these populist leaders, we rely on the classification and that has been done by others. So this should be really done on safe ground, to the extent that this is not our own value judgment, but that of classification, but that of others. Okay, so then we use this database to study the consequences of populism. There's going to be focus on GDP, but we also look at other outcomes. In particular, we're going to look at the distributional indicators. We're going to look at trade, and we're going to also look at what's going to be very important. We're going to look at institutions. We have had the Nobel Prizes 2 weeks ago for work on the importance of institution, and we'll see that this is something an area where populists really do a lot of damage. We are obviously in a tradition of a lot of great research that looks at the economic consequences of political choices, broadly speaking. It's been done for presidencies, Democrats versus Republicans in the US, and many others. And I'll go a little bit into detail in a second. Okay, so first of all, the slightly, not slightly, but very, from a certain perspective at least, very worrying trend is that populism, this is now the share of countries that are governed by populists since 1900 in our database. Remember, this is 60 countries. So at the peak in the 1930s, which was the peak of the previous wave of populist politics, about 10 to 15% of countries in our sample were governed by populists. By now we're close to 25%. So every fourth country in our sample is now governed by a politician. It could be a prime minister, it can be a president, but it's going to be the sort of central decision-making body is in the hands of a populist. And if you I think if you look around, have done, it is actually quite plausible. If you look at, in our definition, I should say, we have countries like Turkey, like Hungary, etc. There are quite a few of those included here in our measurement. So you also see that the darker gray area has been expanding. For the most part, the recent wave of populism in the last 10, 15 years has been a right-wing populism, a populism that emphasizes divisions, frictions, that pitches or loads of ethnic and cultural factors more than having an outright distributional classic sort of left-wing Latin American flavor to them. The second thing is, and this is bad news for some countries who've had the first populist president recently, not that I want to say this is in any way an election forecast here, but populism, what we find in the database is serial. Once a country has had one, and if you will, this is a little bit of a conjecture, but once the sort of the door is opened, these populist politics tend to stay and come back. There are actually quite few examples where countries manage to come back to some kind of normalcy and not have, once this political style and rhetoric and strategy having been successful, it tends to stay. Now let me leave it here. You also see quite of a list of populist politicians that we code by country. There's always going to be disagreement on individual classifications. I think some are reasonably clear, some are more debatable, but overall there is in each of these cases serious academic literature confirming the point. Okay, so another story is that populists that emerges from our data, so that populists are good at surviving in power. So populist leaders tend to rule for many years. The average time in office is 7.5 years compared to 4 years for non-populist leaders. And as I mentioned before, there's a serial nature to populism. Populists have a high re-election probability. So 18 of the 51 populist leaders in our sample show 2 or more spells in office. That's more than 1/3. Non-populists return to power with a much lower probability. And we've all witnessed the events of January 6th. There's another, we discussed this in the paper, there typically is quite a high degree of drama and sometimes even violence when populists leave office. These are hardly ever, or very rarely, very normal transitions of power. So there is something that is, with the political fabric, is affected. Okay, so let me look at economic performance. This is a very first cut of the data. It shows you the annualized growth gap relative to the country level and relative to the global level in the 5-year and the 15-year aftermath. So this compares the growth rates of countries after a populist has come to power relative to the country trend, long-run trend, and relative to the global trend. And both are negative by about 0.5 percentage points. Growing, it's annualized, so growing after time, so after 15 years, these numbers become big, especially relative to the global level. First indication, there's nothing causal here, obviously, this is just a very broad statement. If we run simple event studies, these results remain in place. I'm just going to highlight that in the 5-year aftermath, after populist comes to power, in a simple OLS, and you can throw in country fixed effects, year fixed effects, macro controls. Looks like the growth damage coming from populism is roughly a percentage point less growth per year. That's not nothing. So these are reasonably high numbers. So doesn't mean you go outright into negative growth and recessions, but you lose growth relative to country and global trends. We also run local projections that give you sort of the cumulative effect on GDP per capita over time. So the blue one, it would be the trend, the expected trend, and then the shock to the system, if you treat this as a shock, which obviously I haven't convinced you of, is the red dotted line. So the gap between the two is, if you treat this as a sort of random assignment, the growth damage coming from a populist being a power. These are all just indicative of there might be something, but of course we haven't solved the causality issue. I'm going to jump this in the interest of time and talk about our main tool of identification that many of you have heard of. It's the synthetic control method. What is the synthetic control method? It's a very simple idea that has gained that's become quite popular in recent years in research application, because it allows us to at least with a higher degree of certainty, and I want to be cautious on the words I use, intention, because obviously we're often interested in economic research and treatments that happen at an aggregate level of a country, like here on a whole country is treated by a populist president or a populist prime minister. And typically, there are always lots of reasons and lots of unknowns and lots of uncontrollable properties that distinguish country A from country B. So we'll never be really able to talk about interventions that we're most interested in, namely those that matter for a large number of people. So the idea of the synthetic control is to turn, in a way, these limitations, take them as given, but find a synthetic comparison group of countries. So in a nutshell, what the synthetic control method on a country level does, it looks at the time before the intervention. So think about the 10 years before a populist comes to power, and it builds a synthetic control group for, say, a country like, let's take Hungary, for example, by building a synthetic Hungary, a so-called doppelganger, if you will, if you want to use that German word, in the period before the treatment. And it will just say this is a combination of the growth development or the real economic developments of other countries. And so there probably is going to be a little bit of Austria in there, maybe a little bit of Germany, and a little bit of Italy and other countries. But that pre-intervention growth trend will match the growth of Hungary as closely as possible. And then the idea is, when the intervention comes, it's only Hungary that's treated, but not that synthetic Hungary that's been constructed by giving the best fit before the intervention. And the difference between the treated unit and the control unit, the synthetic control unit, is going to be the causal effect. I'm not going to get too much into the details. There's different strategies to build this doppelganger. Just think of this as some kind of a weighted average of other countries that before the treatment, before the populist enters office, matches the performance of Hungary or any other country that is chosen, that is treated with a populist in the most closely. So if you will, this formalizes something that we often do informally. So we think about the growth performance of the German economy that, as you know, recently has been very bad. We would look at a comparison. Let's say we look at France, we look at the Netherlands, or maybe the UK, or maybe the US, to get an idea how Germany is doing. This is a very ad hoc way of comparing the performance of Germany. The synthetic control formalizes that, or makes it systematic by looking at the countries that before have matched German growth very closely. So what comes out if we use the synthetic control method to estimate the effects of populist in power, of populist treatment on countries? Well, it essentially, you see here on the top left panel for all populists, and then for left-wing and right-wing populists, you see there is a relative to the doppelganger. You see year 0 is the year of the treatment. This is when the populists come into power. And then we build this window 15 years around the populists coming into power. You see, by definition, or by construction, I should say, by construction, the pre-trends are very, very similar in the country that is ultimately treated with a populist and the synthetic control. And then from year 0 on, when only the one country is treated, we see, actually not from year 0, but from year 1 on, effectively, we see a gap. We see that the doppelganger, the synthetic control, the untreated part, which is the dashed line in all these charts, develops much better in terms of GDP per capita trends. There is not a big difference between left wing and right wing. In the lower panels, you can see the gap between the control group and the populist country that opens up over time. And that as a headline number, and this has been the number that we've used to communicate our core finding, is that after a 10-year period, roughly the GDP impact of having a populist in your country is about 10%. Okay, with an eye on time, I'm just gonna run you through a few other results that we have. So one is that Some indicators are like for policy. What do populists do? What's the problem? What indicators deteriorate under populists that could explain? And we're not saying these are the explanatory. These are the explanatory. We're just saying like this is evidence for policy choices taken under populist leaderships that could possibly lead to these negative growth outcomes. One is the tariff rate. I mean, it's something that we talk a lot about these days. You see here that there's a gap in the tariff that opens up between the synthetic control and the treated countries. So tariffs are 5 to 10% higher 10 years. So this populist withdraw with foreign economic policies, with tariff policies from the world economy, which most of us believe has negative effects on growth in the medium to long run at least. You see openness declining, trade GDP, the middle panel, and you also see financial openness declining. That's the panel on the right. We come to some other macro outcomes to give you a flavor of, there's much more in the paper, but I highlight a few. Debt to GDP, this is public debt to GDP, I should have said. So public debt to GDP tends to rise as well. It's not quite as significant. Some of the recent populists have been fiscally quite prudent, not all of them, and not necessarily in the Western Hemisphere, but some of the European ones have been quite fiscally conservative. Inflation rises, although also it's more of a mixed bag. Where we find, and this is my last slide on content here, where we find very strong and very large effects by the nature of these indicators is on institutions. So these are institutions from Freedom House and from other organizations that code the quality of institutions. And I've mentioned Durons and Jim and Atsumoglu, Johnson, Robinson, Simon is the third first names, the Nobel Prize for their work on the importance of institutions for economic development. So what we see is under populist judicial constraints deteriorate, so they're loosened. The executive is less constrained and takes more. Typically, it's a very strong, and you see these significant bounce and being very a strong result. The freedom of election declines, so there's more interference. I think we've seen this time and again in countries, also in recent years. And media freedoms also decline, and we hope that this has a lot to do with the bad economic performance. So this was it from my side. Substantial economic cost of populism, about 10% GDP cost over 10 to 15 years. There is results in the paper that I haven't shown you on distributional effects. There are none. So populism does not improve the fortunes of the people. Populists typically deliver on their nationalist rhetoric, at least if they come from the right. Economic integration falls behind. I guess for an institution like the IMF, this is a particularly worrisome development. And there is in light of the importance of that literature and the rewards and the prices, there's a visible erosion of checks and balances, judicial independence, free and fair election, and press freedom. So with that, thank you very much, and I really look forward to Pierre's presentation and to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moritz. Super interesting. Holding my questions. I'm sure others in the audience are too. So we'll have the general discussion at the end, but I would suggest we move to your presentation, Pierre, and the floor is all yours.
I lost audio.
No, we can hear you. Yeah.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Helen, can you hear me or no?
I can hear you.
Yes, because I can't hear on the other side. So I can go ahead and present, but I can't hear. So hopefully, maybe this will be fixed by the time I'm done, so that we can have a discussion. All right, let me load my slides, and I'll try to be brief. And thank you very much for inviting me to present here. It's a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed the previous presentation, and there's a lot of connections to what I'm presenting here. This is joint work with Hassan, Marina, and Ken, and it's two papers that we've written on the subject of long-run inflation and thinking about long-run inflation from the perspective of central bank political pressures. And it's we have a paper that's a theory paper on one side, and we wrote this up as a Brookings paper that's meant more for a practitioner audience, and that's what I'm presenting here. And so the motivation is that there's a lot of uncertainty about the long-term trajectory of inflation. The prevailing view is that inflation is falling back down to target. It's going to stay there on average, and this view is supported by all central bank forecasts in advanced and emerging economies, though even the emerging economies that have slightly higher inflation targets. There's an alternative view. This view was first articulated in Goodhart and Pradhan's book, and the idea is that inflation will remain higher on average and possibly will be more volatile in the next 5 to 10 years. The logic of this argument is that there's going to be a reversal of the disinflationary forces that Ken highlighted in his 2003 Jackson Hole speech, and those disinflationary forces would have been globalization, demographics, fiscal restraint, particularly in emerging markets. So what do we do in this paper? We ask the following question: what does the new Keynesian framework, which is the one that's used by all central banks, what does this framework say about long-run inflation? That's the question that motivates us. And it turns out that, at least in the academic literature, the current approaches can't answer this question. The current approaches either study transitory dynamics around zero inflation steady state, which by definition means we can't say anything about long-run inflation because it's assumed to be zero. Or alternatively, there is some work looking at long-run inflation in a model where central banks commit to an infinite policy sequence. And in that environment, you end up with zero inflation independently of economic parameters. So basically, you can't say anything about long-run inflation there either. So what do we do here? We discard with these sort of two frameworks that prevail in the literature. We say, let's look at them all. Let's not linearize around zero inflation, and let's not have full commitment. Okay. Once we go around that, we end up with a framework where economic factors will interact with central bank discretion, and that's going to lead to both exogenous, meaning economic factors, as well as endogenous, which we can think of as political factors, exerting pressure on central banks. And that interaction between different economic factors and central bank discretion is going to lead to a way to make sense of past disinflationary forces and future inflationary forces. So it's going to be a framework for thinking about long-run inflation that's been missing in the literature. So let me give you let me give you an idea of what we do here. We take the standard New Keynesian model. This is a model that features monopolistically competitive firms that set prices under Calvo-style rigidity, so they can only change prices every once in a while. Households make consumption, labor, and savings decisions. And there's two types of inefficiencies that arise in such an environment. The first inefficiency is that there are markups, so there are monopoly distortions. Another way to say that there are markups is to say that the labor share is not equal to 1, because there's no capital here. So if the labor share is below 1, it means there are markups. That's one distortion. You can think about that as an aggregate distortion. There's also another distortion, which is price dispersion or misallocation, where some varieties have higher prices than others. And that's happening because of the staggered price setting situation. So that's the model we take off the shelf, and we do two departures from this model. First, we do not approximate around zero inflation, and second, we take an extreme situation, obviously not the world, but we look at an extreme case where instead of having full commitment, you have no commitment. And in addition to having no commitment, we imagine that we are delegating central banking to a central bank that has a potential bias that is disinflationary bias. So this is basically how Rogoff modeled this almost 40 years ago. So, and we do the, we have a paper where we do this in a fully nonlinear model. We look at the Markov perfect equilibrium. I'm not going to bore you with all of that, but I'm going to look at a simple setting today and show you how that entire full model boils down to a very simple long-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate demand representation. And that representation allows us to do different types of exercises to think about how different pressures manifest themselves in changes in long-run inflation. And I do want to say that this framework allows one to think about transitory dynamics. It allows us to think about quantification and those sorts of things. So it goes beyond what you would think of if you just studied the Barrow-Gordon model. So here's the model. There's a long-run aggregate supply curve that's upward sloping. There's a long-run aggregate demand curve that's downward sloping. Inflation's on the y-axis, output's on the x-axis. And long-run inflation is where these two intersect. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where these curves come from, and then I'll give you a couple of examples of what happens. The long-run aggregate supply curve, you can think of it as a long-run Phillips curve. Increases in output are associated. I'm sorry, this is capitalized. It should be lowercase. Are associated with increases in inflation. And the way you can think about this is it's a long-run relationship. I mean, it's not just a short run. In the short run, you think, well, increases in output are associated with increases in real wages and increases in marginal costs, and that pushes the flexible price firms to increase prices. Here, the argument is slightly more subtle. The idea is that if real wages are permanently higher, okay, then that means that excuse me, if real wages are permanently higher, that means that firms anticipate permanently higher absolute changes in nominal wages because you have higher real wages and those real wages are rising at a faster pace because of inflation. And so firms anticipate the possibility of underpricing in the future and when they set their prices. And because they don't want to be underpricing, they will more aggressively increase their prices when they can. So you end up with a positive relationship between real wages and inflation in the long run. And that relationship underpins the long-run aggregate supply curve. Naturally, if we had full-blown indexation, we would not have an upward sloping long-run aggregate supply curve. We would have a vertical supply curve, as in Friedman's 1968 AEA address. So that is why you have a long-run aggregate supply curve that's upward sloping. That should be pretty familiar to everybody. It's not perfectly vertical because we have staggered price setting. The less familiar curve, which comes from the fact that we're not linearizing anymore, is a downward sloping long-run aggregate demand curve. That relationship comes from the following, which is that if you have higher inflation, you end up with lower demand. Now, why is that? That's because higher inflation means higher price dispersion. And if you have higher price dispersion, you end up with lower overall consumption demand because some varieties are too expensive and others are too cheap. And this never shows up in the standard nonlinear or in the standard model that everybody uses because around zero inflation, that demand decline due to added dispersion is second order. But here, because we're allowing for long-run inflation to be 1%, 2%, or whatever, it's no longer a second order loss. So then we're going to have a downward sloping long-run aggregate demand curve. The equilibrium is where these two cross, okay? And what I have drawn so far is a representation that can accommodate any central banking framework. Now, what a central banking framework does is it implies a process for the labor share or for the aggregate markup. So everything I talked about so far assumed constant markups over the long run, and I drew those two curves. But when we talk about monetary policy, you end up making a statement about a process for markups. And it turns out, and this is a useful observation for us in the paper, and naturally I don't have enough time to explain why this is, but if you had a model where you have no commitment and central banks optimize in every period, it turns out that that leads to a situation where markups are constant or labor share is constant over time in the long run. And that observation allows us to think about central banks essentially choosing interest rates in a way that keeps those markups constant over time. And then firms take that into account, and then we end up with this representation of equilibrium. So why is this useful? This is useful because now we can say things about long-run inflation, and that's what I'm going to do next before saying some things about the past and the future. So we can start in a situation where we are at this long-run level of inflation where these two curves cross. And we can ask ourselves, well, what happens if we have a deglobalization shock? What happens if we end up in a scenario where, there's more monopoly power? That's technically how we model this out. So firms themselves have higher monopoly power. They have more pricing power. Well, that's going to shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the left, because firms, when they set prices, are going to be more aggressive in terms of increasing prices, given that they have that additional monopoly power. And it turns out that in the transition from a lower inflationary steady state to a higher inflationary steady state, what we can show in our model is that we're going to end up with overshooting. So inflation will spike up once the deglobalization shock hits, and will gradually come down to a higher inflation steady state. A way to think about why this overshooting happens, and this is one way to think about how this is really different from Barrow-Gordon, which was essentially static, is that we have a deglobalization shock that increases the monopoly power of domestic firms. Those firms take advantage of that power to increase prices and raise profits. But as the economy hums along, everybody anticipates that demand will gradually decline, because we're going to have decreases essentially in productivity as price dispersion increases. And that gradual reduction in demand, gradual reduction in real wages, means that inflation in the future need not be as high as inflation in the present. And that's the logic of overshooting. I'll just show you what happens if you have a Paul Volcker shock in this sort of economy, which is that you can basically get inflation you can have output and inflation decrease in the short run, big time, but then you can have a situation where inflation gradually rises back up to a lower level, but also output permanently increases. So you can have a situation where a disinflation, a permanent disinflation, actually leads to an expansion of output because you have a reduction in the dispersion of prices. So you can see that the framework is sort of general and allows us to evaluate changes in long-run inflation in the new Keynesian models. That's part of the contribution of this paper. So let me just conclude by saying one thing about the general insight that we get in this model, and then apply it to the world. General insight of the model is that you can think about long-run inflation as doing two things. On the one hand, it's a tool for central banks to reduce aggregate distortions. Okay, it's a way to reduce aggregate monopoly power in this particular model, but more broadly, you can think about aggregate distortions. But it also comes at a cost of an increase in idiosyncratic price dispersion distortions. So there is a long-run trade-off. The central bank has a single instrument in determining that trade-off. And under commitment, you get one thing, but under no commitment, i.e. discretion, you get something else. And what we get here is a level of inflation that responds to the economic environment. So how do we think about this framework in terms of the real world? And this is, I'll conclude with this stuff. Well, it's been the case that we see inflation decreasing over the past 30 years in every single income group of countries, okay, even those that haven't had improvements in central bank independence. So it does appear like there are trends, long-run trends that cause inflation to go down that go beyond just central bank independence. And as we argue in the paper, one of those is globalization. What happens when you have globalization? Globalization puts downward pressure on prices. It lowers the monopoly power of the domestic firms, and that reduces inflation. Another way to think about long-term trends is to consider the fact that the Washington Consensus, via privatization, market liberalization, also diminished monopoly power. Those things also reduce the endogenous pressures on central banks to inflate. And by reducing those endogenous political pressures on central banks to inflate, you get lower inflation. You can think about lower fiscal pressures as sort of operating sort of like the Paul Volcker shock that I described, where lower fiscal pressures mean that central banks feel less political pressure to pursue expansionary monetary policy to support fiscal policy. In the paper, we describe the channels through that works, which is both through the devaluation of outstanding debt or through the reduction in the rollover cost of current debt. So both of those channels, by having less fiscal pressure, central banks feel less incentives to inflate. Another factor we talk about is deunionization. In the new Keynesian model, it works very much like monopoly power. And when you have lower labor market power, in this model, that also leads to lower inflation. You have less endogenous political pressure on central banks to allow inflation to expand. And then finally, we discuss the more sort of conventional approach for the disinflation of the past 30 years, which is the expansion of central bank independence. we add to that discussion this idea that the zero lower bound also induced a hawkish tilt to central banking, and closeness to the zero lower bound can also explain the disinflationary pressures of the last decade. So in thinking about the past, we think that central bank reforms do explain some, but maybe not all of the declines in inflation. Plenty of examples exist where inflation declined even in places without central bank independence. And we think that this is a pretty good channel to think of, which is that these central banks just didn't feel the pressure to inflate. They had the wind at their back in their quest to disinflate, and having low inflation was easy in the past 30 years. And there's plenty of evidence of this too. If you just look at cross-sectional correlations, countries with more market openness tend to have lower inflation. Countries with lower public debts also tend to have lower inflation. So the cross-sectional evidence is certainly consistent with this. What about the future? The view, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that the future involves one where inflationary pressures will come back down to these long-run levels. And our view is that that's not necessarily correct. There's lots of work that's been done, of course, by the IMF about trends in deglobalization. I'm not going to repeat those for you, but you are all familiar with them. If you have deglobalization, that induces an increase in the endogenous political economy pressure on central banks to allow inflation to increase. So it makes the job of central banks harder to have deglobalization because it creates upward pressure on inflation. And so you have to imagine that if central banks' jobs become tougher, that some central banks are going to cave in. We're going to end up with higher average long-run inflation in the world. Higher debt to GDP ratios, as was mentioned at the beginning, are likely to be high across numerous country groups. And that's not just because the debts are high, but it's because the primary deficits are high. The current forecasts may even be too optimistic. They're not taking into account the green transition, the industrial policy of many countries. They're not taking into account that defense spending is likely to increase if what's going on in the world continues. And with that, with those trends in mind, you can imagine that you're going to have more pressure on central banks to keep inflation high. Finally, the other thing I want to note is that long-term real interest rates are likely to return to their long-term trends. And as interest rates move away from the zero lower bound, that does induce a more dovish tilt on central banks because central banks are no longer artificially straitjacketed by the constraints of the zero lower bound. And that's an additional force that makes it harder for central banks to keep inflation low because now they have more wiggle room to decrease interest rates. So in sum, it seems like the pressures for central banks to keep inflation, the job of central banks to keep inflation low is getting a lot harder in the 2020s relative to the 2000s or 2010s or before 1990s. And of course, I do want to mention that our forecast could be wrong. It could be that deglobalization reverses. It could be that geopolitical tensions dissipate. It could be that the ZLB returns as a constraint on central banks. Or it could be that central banks themselves experience renewed reform, or that we could have fiscal reforms that make this outlook, that would modify my outlook. But without any of these things, it's likely that inflation will remain higher on average, and that countries will experience more inflation spikes of the type that we saw. So in sum, what do we do in this paper? We have a long-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate demand framework for thinking about long-run inflation. In this framework, a central bank has a single instrument in light of that trade-off. And the framework is useful for thinking through past inflation and also thinking through future and inflation and providing reasons why delivering low and stable inflation in the future is going to be more difficult than it has been in the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Very, very, very clear and very related to Moritz's first presentation, actually. So we are opening the floor to your questions and comments and thoughts for all participants. You can either post them in the chat or unmute and come on camera and ask your question. I don't think we have questions in the chat right now. And while you're gathering your thoughts, I want to check first if Pierre, you can hear
I can hear, yeah, my audio came back, thankfully.
Okay, this is wonderful. Okay, so while the audience gathers their thoughts, I do have a couple questions. The first one is for you, Moritz, about, I wonder if you've looked at the short-term effects as well of populism. Your horizon, your focus is on the medium term to long run, but I wonder sort of if voters are rational, why would they vote for this economic debacle, right? So I wonder if there are positive short-term effects, sort of economic myopia at play, whereby maybe populist governments, outcomes in under populist governments are not so different in the short term, or even better, possibly. But in the long run, you pay the cost. So that was one question. And also, if you could say more about the right wing versus left wing, because it's absolutely striking in your chart, the distinction between the rise of the right wing more recently. So I have questions for Pierre, but let's start with you.
I'll be quick. I think these are fantastic questions. So I mean, why bad things happen is indeed a very philosophical question. Bad things happen. I think to your question, I think there are two different streams or likely potential answers. One is, well, we look at our effects on the aggregate. I mean, we looked at the Gini, but even that is a relatively broad, phenomenon. So it is totally possible that certain groups imagine you restrict immigration, and it is very much possible that this is, at least in the short run, good for the real wages of those people who compete with migrants, maybe in the sort of lower half of the income distribution. So they could certainly, on the distributional sides, construct a few stories where, at least in the short run, you'd say like their loss is my gain, and we have have an economic motive for this election choice. In the medium to long run, I think the growth effects will dominate. The cake is not getting bigger, and that will very likely make most people in society worse off relative to the counterfactual. But I think that was where your question was headed. Like, I think I can see a world where if I'm a little bit myopic and I just care about maybe my real wage for the next 2 years, I choose a candidate that wants to restrict immigration, and I think that will make it easier for me to find a job or get a higher wage. If you want to go that far, I'm thinking like the economic rationale behind these choices is so deep and refined to some extent. But it brings me to your second question. Yes, it's indeed a new phenomenon, and a very successful phenomenon is this right-wing populism that is different from the traditional, I would call it like spend, macro boom bust populism that was associated with a lot of what's going on in Latin America in the 60s and 70s and partly even in the 80s. This is what Rudy Dornbusch and Sebastian Edwards wrote about. Is like maybe more think about this like as the Venezuelan situation, where macro policies are clearly not sustainable. Inflation after a while gets out of control, where the budget is not balanced, and where you probably call in the fund to get things right after a while. That boom bust pattern is no longer dominant when you turn to these sort of more right wing, more ethno-nationalist, anti-migration. Think about Brexit. Think about what's happening in other parts of Europe. Style of populism that it often even goes along with a kind of fiscally quite conservative agenda. And we think the damage here, the fact that the damage there is also there, points to a more complex picture, namely one where also the closing off, if you will, the protectionist instincts, the tariff policies, the closing off to globalization, what Pierre just talked about, the deglobalization shock that comes with these policies, also has an impact, a negative impact on growth, and that's why we also, when we split the sample, get these effects for the populists. There is something that unites them, which is they do damage to institutions. And I think in the medium to long run, I do think that is think about corruption. If you think of checks and balances, you think about the loss in confidence, the investment that is linked to the idea that you can also reap the rewards of your investment down the road. All of that gets eroded, gets a little crowny-ish, and I think that is in the medium to long run one of the big effects, and that's similar for both types of populism, at least in the data.
Very interesting. Thanks, Moritz. So we have a question from Barry in the chat, which I'll actually extend to both of you, Moritz and Pierre, because I think Pierre's paper also has some views on that. So the question that Barry has is: are there actions that policymakers and civil society, international financial institutions can take or recommend to reduce the levels of populism from the data? And I'm going to pose that question to both speakers because I think there are also some ideas that you had, Pierre, as well. The question is directed to you, Moritz. So.
But I'm happy, Lily, let Pierre go first. You're closer to the eye of the storm right now, Pierre. So.
Oh, sure. Well, I don't know how to reduce populism, but I think that in terms of central banks, I think one idea to think about is many central banks central banks are constantly doing strategic reviews of their operating frameworks. In the case of the Fed, I think that they can take the opportunity here to double down on making sure that their target of long-run inflation at 2% has to be consistent with their employment target, right? So if you think about it, they are not two distinct things. The employment target is not divorced from the 2% target. It has to be consistent with it. So inflation is the most important. I also have other views. These are not the views of my co-authors, but I have other views about the past strategic review and some of its shortcomings, which some people suggest led to the increase in inflation. So I think that the Fed could take advantage of this next review to talk about to clarify that what it really means, and to double down on inflation targeting, basically. Because I think there was a lot of ambiguity in the last review.
So let me second that and maybe reinforce some of the points that Pierre made. I think there are three strategies or three different levels to make sort of reduce or prepare for, what I say, against populist takeover. So one is institutional, and that's what many countries, including Germany, actually is doing at the moment, which is to reinforce institutional hurdles actually to change the rules of the game. So if you think about appointment of constitutional court judges, if you think about rules to change sort of the basic rules of the political game, some societies are anticipating that populism is a threat, and they're sort of reinforcing that institutional framework. There is a political science literature, but it's really early, and this is the second level, is how do you react politically. There's a political science literature that's like, how do sort of normal, if you want to use that word, like traditional democratic mainstream people, how do you potentially counter populist movements? And there isn't much agreement. There is maybe some agreement that demobilization of voters is what works best. The question is if that is something that is democratically and sort of ethically quite recommendable. Is sort of saying like, this is you try to get effectively, you try to prevent those people that are most likely to vote for populists to you give them the right to vote, obviously, but you have strategies that demobilize them. Is questionable. And the third one is economic and social. I guess this is the point where what I have to say connects to what Pierre has to say. I think we know from the 1930s experience that on the political stability, social stability side, and I guess it also reinforces what Pierre just said, is the pressure to counter these populist waves with additional levels of social spending, with at least in the short run, trying to stabilize the economy, keep social benefits high, at least not cutting them and not having austerity programs, is one of the lessons. The question is always to what extent it applies today, what we've learned in the early 1930s. But I guess I would say that the evidence from the economic history literature and even some recent studies from the Euro crisis, and many people at the fund, I guess, have lived through that and have memories, is that austerity policy in times of crisis, whatever the economic benefits, it makes the political picture more complicated and has been water on the mills of populists in the past.
I was just picking up on the last thing you said, Moritz. I was just wondering whether either one of you would have advice for the IMF on how they can incorporate those political economy factors into their recommendations. But actually, that is you touched on one of those, which is to pay attention to social spending and social protection and keep those benefits in place. And I think that's something that the IMF's thinking over the last since the financial crisis for sure has internalized quite a bit, quite prominently. So we have more questions in the chat. Would Samuel, would you like to come in and ask your question? I can also read it for you.
Sure, I can answer directly. Ask directly. Sorry. Okay. So two-part question for Moritz. One is whether you have studied if there's any diffusion of populism across, say, geographic lines. You mentioned that there's persistence at the country level. I was wondering if there's contagion as well. The second point the second question I had is whether you've seen evidence of improvements or reversals in these declines that you see when populist regimes take over. So when the populist movement ends or stopped, whether there are economic improvements, institutional improvements, and so on.
Two excellent questions. Thank you. Thank you very much, Samuel. We have indeed there are. I mean, we haven't done a formal analysis, but the populism tends to cluster regionally. I think that is true. There's much more trade, there's much more cultural exchange, and there's also much more political exchange, flow of ideas. And so we've observed this clearly in Latin America in the post-war period in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And maybe to some extent you can argue what's happening in Europe right now is a contagion of populism as well. Obviously, some of the underlying issues are also correlated and the same. So it doesn't really give you an idea about the causal effect. But if you just look at these sort of descriptive time series evidence, you will get an idea that there are regional clusters and over time. The other question is interesting. I need to think. We haven't done this. Like, when does how long does this damage last? I mean, some of these damages extend. I mentioned like the effects are high 10, 15 years after the populist comes to power. On average, populists are out of power, so these effects tend to be long lasting. It's a good idea. We can look at we have this is with any precision. But I mean, this is a caveat, but when things move back to trend, this is somewhat related to the question of like financial crises. How long lasting is the damage? When do countries return to previous growth trends? I think we've learned after 2008 somewhat that it's not just fixing the plumbing of the financial sector and then everything's fine again, but there's some more long-lasting damages and it takes time to outgrow them. It would be interesting to have something like the halftime of populist, like the negative effects of populist governance on economies. So I'll take that as a suggestion.
Maybe I'll mention one related paper. It's called "Learning the Wealth of Nations" by Pierre, Monge Naranjo, and Primiceri. That paper looks at, it's not exactly populism, but it's market openness as the policy measure to look at. And what they show is that you get waves of market openness across countries. It does follow a contagious path where you tend to learn from your peers, and you tend to learn about whether openness or being closed is a good or a bad thing when you look at your peers. And so you can sort of track those waves from the 1970s towards openness. And that paper is about 15 years old, so somebody could probably do that exercise now and see the wave in the reverse and how that's happened.
And I wonder also if there's sort of a less, like, if somebody has the flu next to you, you can catch a full-on flu, or you can just catch a little cold, right? So maybe in countries where the populist or far right or such do not rise into power, don't have the majority, but nonetheless rise to a level that they become a significant part of the political landscape, then you can end up in policy paralysis type situations, which probably are not leading to good outcomes either. So maybe it's milder impact. But I think in your paper, Moritz, you focus on sort of, okay, the populists are in power, the populist policies are treating the economy, but you could also think of inability to get anything done, which probably is negative as well. But we have more questions in our chat, and Hamid, I actually don't understand your question. I think it's for both speakers. So would you like to ask it out loud to come in? Otherwise, I'll read it.
Yeah, please go ahead, read it, please.
Okay. So I think it is for both of our speakers. So Hamid says that Tony Blair, the former UK Prime Minister, once defined populism as actively listening to public grievances but not offering solutions. Does this definition offer a solution to policymakers or to us going forward?
Yeah, I'm happy to go ahead.
Why don't you go, Moritz?
Yeah, okay. So I think this is a very it's far too mild and slightly naive comment by Prime Minister Blair. I think while it's undeniable that populists pick up on public grievances, what they typically do goes beyond just not offering solutions. It's seeking solutions to real problems, often also problems that are made up, that aren't real problems, sometimes invented problems. I think we've all had a fair share of fake news in recent weeks, and offer solutions that are economically and in many ways institutionally and politically actually do damage. So I would somewhat disagree with this as it's too benign. This being said, I think there is a point here, and I think we should not forget that. For example, some of the social democratic movements that, like the Labour Party in Britain or the Social Democrats in Germany and other places, or the Parti Socialiste in France, historically have been labeled populists, and we would now think of them as they channeled the grievances of maybe the working class, and some of these points were justified, and they integrated into the institutions. And so we need to be careful not to abuse the term and just use it for any political opponent, and really be what I hope we did in this paper, and I convinced you of, use a very precise definition that the political science literature has pioneered for good reasons, and focus on this, this different strategy that is essentially not wanting to integrate into an existing system, but polarizing within the system with the intent of really delegitimizing it.
Pierre, do you have some views as well, or?
I guess my 2 cents on this is, my paper was not exactly about populism, but this is more my personal opinion. But I view populism as a response to a phenomenon that I think Danny Roderick spelled out, which is this trilemma of not being able to have simultaneously having an open economy, having sovereignty, and having democracy. And I see populism as a response to the threats to sovereignty that a lot of these nations face. And so you have to address those issues. because of the tensions. And so, and that's what this is.
It's true that your paper is not directly on populism, but the one possible side effect of populism is a loss of central bank independence.
No,
so that is the I think there's a really close link potentially between the two topics. So unfortunately, we ran we're at the end of our time. So I want to thank you, Moritz and Pierre, from the bottom of my heart for being here with us today and sharing your wisdom. I mean, I just think this has been fascinating conversation, and it's very helpful to so many here trying to make sense of this economic and political uncertainty. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I thank each of you for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you on more of the IEO series. So bye for now. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.